You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter. Brendan Watkins was 8 years old when he was told that he and his brother were adopted from different families. His brother wasn't that interested, but Brendan was, viscerally. He instantly wanted to know who his biological parents were. Were they rock stars, princesses and princes, teenagers? He had a lot of different thoughts growing up, but he never pursued it. Until in 1990, at the age of 29, Brendan decided to apply for his original birth certificate because that would carry the names of his biological parents. So a meeting was set up at the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau in Melbourne. But it wasn't what he expected. Brendan's mother was a nun. He tracked her down and even met her eventually, but that didn't go how he'd imagined it either.
I think it was more fear, and now knowing what I know, it was a survival mechanism, to be honest. She kept giving me different stories.
It took another 30 years for Brendan to discover something even more gobsmacking. His father was a priest. Globally, there are thousands of children of priests, just like Brendan, who as adults have found their biological parents through DNA testing and social media groups. There are 450,000 Catholic priests around the world, and although there are no accurate records, it's estimated that they've fathered over 20,000 children. This is one of those stories. Brendan, near the start of your book, you share a quote from the author Jeanette Winterson, which I found really riveting. She said, "Adoption drops you into the story after it has started. It's like reading a book with the first few pages missing." When the book did start, when you found out that you were adopted, where were you at in your life?
Well, I was just a kid. It was 1969, so I was 8 years old, living in Richmond, and suddenly it was like a switch had been flicked, and I knew it was such a significant occurrence in my life. It sort of answered, some of these things that were floating around in my head. I think even as an 8-year-old that, maybe my brother wasn't my birth brother and my adoptive parents weren't my birth parents. And I knew the moment we were told that everything in my life would change. And, ironically, my adoptive brother, who I love very much, just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Oh, yeah, let's go and kick the footy."
You talk about your parents, Bet and Roy. They seem just so beautiful, your adoptive parents. What did they tell you about the circumstances of your and your brother's adoptions? How did they frame it to you? Because you were pretty young.
Yeah, well, 8 seems in that era, so 50s, 60s, 70s, that was sort of about the time adopted kids were told. You didn't learn much other than your parents couldn't keep you and that they'd been asked to provide a good home and that they would love us forever and it was permanent. We were both adopted, different parents. And that was kind of it. We were asked, did we have questions? And I didn't know what to ask. It was only much later that questions were swarming through my brain. But it was a closed subject after that discussion was had.
Was there an implicit understanding in you that your parents wouldn't want you to look for your birth parents and that it would be a betrayal?
Yeah, very much. It wasn't something that they promoted. It wasn't a notion that they promoted, but within society and as I grew older, gratitude was the word. That you should have enormous gratitude that somebody loved you and took you and cared for you and that, ultimately maybe the unspoken was that you were saved from an orphanage and that it could have been much worse. But within the church, I think particularly the Catholic Church, it's underlined that this is something that we really need to show gratitude for, that we need to pray to the heavens above, and the subject's closed.
That's really heavy because the flip side of the gratitude is the shame of being unwanted.
Yeah, and unanswered questions. And Damien, my brother, and I are a classic example. It didn't impact him, but it did me. And a lot of people had lots of questions.
A real hero in this story is your partner, Kate, who was very instrumental in your whole experience of finding your birth parents. And what's even more interesting is the fact that she had a medical condition that was hereditary that had caused deaths in her family. That's what finally decided you on the idea of moving forward with looking for your birth parents. Can you talk about that and when you decided that it was time to start looking?
Yeah, well, I guess there were two things happening in parallel. One was that because the closed adoption system throughout Australia wasn't really working, there were always amendments to the legislation in each state. And in the 80s, increasingly, there were stories about, unsuccessful adoptions.
What's an unsuccessful adoption? And when you say closed adoptions, can you explain what that means?
Well, closed adoptions where essentially no one had access to the information, birth information. So the records were closed. A birth certificate, an amended birth certificate was issued with the adoptive parents named as parents, and that was it. There was nothing else you could do to find out anything else, let alone medical information. And so the legislation was changing. I'm in Victoria, and eventually in 84, they began opening up closed adoption records, and adoptees could get access to the names of their birth parents, or at least their birth mother, whatever appeared on the original closed birth certificate. So that was going on, and, there was lots of media stories about wonderful reunions of adoptees with birth parents and all sorts of startling things people were discovering as the records were slowly being unlocked and people were getting access to them. And I was, in my 20s, and I'd met Kate and thought, yep, she's a keeper. This is something that, we were bound for a long-term relationship. And as I got to my late 20s, children were the obvious consideration, and we started thinking about having kids. And around that time, she discovered she had malignant hypothermia, which, day to day is no issue whatsoever, but it can cause extreme reactions if someone has certain anaesthetics or most anaesthetics. And it had inadvertently killed members of her family when undergoing innocuous medical procedures. So it underlined, here's an opportunity. The records were being unlocked. She had an issue that needed to be seriously considered. I knew nothing about things that run in the family. And so that, in my mind, gave me justification to make an application and get my original birth records.
It's interesting what you say about things changing from being closed because, as you point out, the whole adoption system was very much until that point designed to protect the relinquishing parents, usually mother, and didn't really take into account the rights of the adopted child to know their birthright and know their medical history. And so around that time in the 80s when thinking was changing and you started that process, what was the first step you took? Like, who was the keeper of that information about you?
It's regulated by the state, but the state allowed various churches or denominations to manage the adoption process of people of their faith. And so I was Catholic, adopted into a Catholic family, and so the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau managed the adoption, and they had a gaggle of government regulations, criteria that they had to meet about record keeping and process and protocols and the like. And so I initially had an interview with a site clearance, essentially, with a government Department of Justice worker, and they then pass you on to the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau that managed the adoption. I thought and crossed my fingers that I'd have this meeting and I'd be given my birth certificate, and, I was hopeful that my birth mother and father's names were there and I might be lucky enough to have one of these happy reunions.
What happened when you got your birth certificate?
Well, the first thing that happened was I learnt my mother's name, Maggie Becker, which sounded like an unusual name. It wasn't the Anglo name, I suppose, I was thinking of. I learnt she was, by this stage, I was late 20s, so I'd done a lot of reading about adoption and, stereotypical scenarios, and mine was really different. So she was 27 when she had me. And, that's very often, from the 60s, an age that you might guess that the mother might have been married and had a family of her own. She was from another state. She was from South Australia, and there was no detail of my father. So there was a box that was empty with his name. And so an unusual name, another state, and a much older woman than I anticipated.
Without Google or even the internet, what do you do next to hunt someone down?
I wanted to go the whole way. I wanted to have contact, and ostensibly it was because of this medical issue that Kate had, and we were about to have kids. It was really significant that we knew medical information. If our children were born, our anticipated children were born and had some medical issue and needed a medical intervention, this malignant hyperpyrexia or anything else I was carrying, anything else that was swimming around in my gene pool, was going to impact them. So, I really wanted, in the barest minimum, to know that. And so I was asked at the time by the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau social worker if I wanted to make contact. And I said, absolutely. Can we ring now? Do we write? What do we do? And she was very discouraging initially. She didn't say you can't, but very discouraging. And eventually said, well, if that's really what you want to do, I'll do that on your behalf. And so I agreed, and I was shuffled off and told I'd be contacted, and there'd be another meeting after contact had been made, assuming that she was alive. And so I was sent away, and 2 or 3 weeks later had a call to go in and have a conversation and learn more.
You learned that your biological mother didn't want to have any contact with you.
Yeah, which was, an enormous blow to be told that you'll never meet her, you'll never see her, you'll never talk to her. I was told to go home and forget her forever.
How do you process that kind of rejection? I mean, you're an adult man, but you must have felt like a little boy again, did you?
I think it's one of those traumas that sort of reverberates silently for years. I think at the time you don't really, maybe it's a self-protection thing. You don't really absorb it. My inclination at the time was to think, there's been a misunderstanding. Why would anyone say that? Why would a mother ever say that to their child?
When did you find out she was a nun?
So well before the age of Google. So the only way to really find out where people were the white pages. And so I got a tram into the city. The GPO had all the phone books. And I went through all the phone books looking for this unusual name. And her name was the only name, Maggie Becker, in the white pages in Sydney. And I had her. And so I jumped on the tram and I went home, and Kate and I sort of plotted about what to do next. And after some discussions with Jigsaw, which was a secular adoption agency in Victoria, it was decided that Kate should make the call. And we, through electoral rolls, found a relative of my mother, and Kate rang, and not wanting to give my mother's identity away, said she was ringing and had lost contact with Maggie Becker and just wanted to know where she was at the moment and if there was contact details. And the reply came back, oh, you mean Maggie the nun?
I imagine that wasn't in your imaginings about your mother, that she'd been a nun.
It was about the only thing I hadn't contemplated. And so she rang me at work and said, are you sitting down? Your mother's a nun.
You got her address, you wrote her a couple of letters that she didn't reply to. This was all just so heartbreaking to read because you just kept going again and again, persistently. And the third letter you wrote, she did reply to.
Yeah, so it was a reasonably complex letters going backwards and forwards, and eventually some came back. And I eventually got her address and did get a letter back from her, and she didn't tell me much. And essentially said, if you want answers, you need to go back to the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau, which I did. and got a very, very icy reception that I'd been a bad boy. I'd not listened to them. And it was almost as though, well, you deserve what you get kind of thing. And that was it, essentially. I assumed that my mother was in a convent. From that day on, I'd always pictured this Maggie Becker somewhere or other in New South Wales, maybe in a convent. And it was that way right through until 2007.
What happened then?
Well, my parents, Roy and Bet, had both passed away by that stage. And, I guess, like a lot of people realise, with kids, they're absolutely frantic, busy, keep you on your toes for those early years. And my parents were gone, and the sort of issue of not having gratitude and not having to tell them the truth of what had gone on. And, I had a reasonable amount of angst around the fact that I'd found my mother, I'd got my records, I'd made contact, and I found out she was a nun. And these two devout Catholic parents, thank God I didn't tell them I was doing what I was doing, because it might have been the end of them a lot earlier than the years they got. So we decided to have another go and to make contact again. So 1992, I found out she was a nun, and 2008, again with Kate's collaboration, I spoke to my mother. She agreed to talk to me.
After the break, the first conversation Brendan had with his mum and the reunion that didn't go according to plan. Stay with us. What was that first phone call like?
One of the first things she said is, "Your father's dead," which I just thought was a really unusual thing to say as far as order of things went. I felt very much that the conversation was, reluctantly agreed to. She didn't really want to do it. But Kate had persuaded her that, I had questions. There was, discussions I wanted to have. And I found out in that discussion that she hadn't been a nun since the 1980s. So the whole time I'd thought, this devout nun mother of mine was in a convent somewhere. Even when I first made contact with her, she'd resigned. She'd been a nun for 25 years, but she'd resigned. And not long after I made contact, at the start of the 90s, she was living in the apartment she was living in, which I later met her in. And she hadn't been a nun for a long time. She didn't give me a lot of information. I was really disappointed to learn my father was dead, and she essentially said she didn't know much at all about him, and was very vague even about the nature of their relationship or where or when they'd met. And, I suppose one of the things you often think in those circumstances, or people that have been through these sorts of experiences, is you think the worst. And so you think, so what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Was I the result of something forced? Was I the result of rape or incest? Or what's the worst thing you could imagine? Maybe that's why she's been so difficult about all of this. She was a nun, for God's sake. Couldn't she show a bit of compassion?
That was what really shone through to me the most about Maggie Becker. And she is still alive, we should say. But to me, it was her lack of compassion for you in those years that stretch decades of you trying to find information about your father, about her, about the time when she gave you up and the circumstances of your conception and birth. She really lacked compassion. She was almost hostile. In fact, at times she was hostile, wasn't she?
Yeah. Well, she was slippery is what she was. Yeah, I probably wouldn't use the word hostile. Now, knowing what I know, I think it was more fear. And now knowing what I know, it was a survival mechanism, to be honest. And so much that she was articulate and she was intelligent, and she kept giving me different stories. So there was some communication, through letters and very rare phone calls. And, she initially said, he's dead. And then, a year or so later, she didn't know what happened to him. And then a couple of years after that, she said when she first found out she was pregnant, she made contact. She had his phone number. And she rang a few times and he wasn't going to help. He was this handsome man who wasn't totally honest with me. And she eventually rang and the phone was disconnected. And so I was, well, where's the phone number? What was his name? And she just got vague. And, eventually a letter came back from her, and I think it was 2010. And she said, I've always told you his name. This is his name. And so I hired a private detective, and I had a private detective running around New South Wales trying to find this man, Paul Hayes. And it sort of made sense in a lot of ways that my father's name was Paul Hayes because I'd been named Paul. So it's, the only thing she'd given me was a name at my adoption. And eventually a private detective came back and said, no, that's not true. There is no Paul Hayes. I've spoken or had some contact with just about every Paul Hayes in the country. He kept coming back saying, look, wild goose chase, we're not going to find this guy. I think it's made up. And I kept sending him back into the field to not give up, and, ended up spending a fair bit of money. And he eventually said, look, it's made up. It's not real. Keep sending me checks if you want, but that's not your dad.
Everything that she told you about your dad was a lie because he was actually a priest. How did you find that out in the end?
After this private detective hunt, I wrote to my mother and said, look, I've had a private detective and Paul Hayes isn't my father. And she wrote back and said, I'm glad you did what you did because your father obviously wasn't who he said he was, and I was dumped and so were you.
Oh, so she still kept lying.
Yeah, she did. So that was 2010, and I raised the white flag. It was all over. There was nothing else I could do. And eventually DNA became a thing and ancestry became a thing. And, the minute I started reading stories about, people being released from death row and people finding siblings and people discovering their father isn't their father and whatever else, I knew that it was something I was going to have to do. So in 2015, I did my DNA. I submitted a sample to Ancestry and thought, great, this is it. If my father's out there, I'll find him. So I did all you need to do, and I think you wait 6 weeks. And, I was hoping for the email to come back and say, XYZ is your father. But it didn't happen like that. It took 3 years entirely at Kate's effort to locate my father, and she had pared it down to 3 or 4 men in Sydney, who we found a link with Maggie Becker, shared addresses through electoral rolls, and a call was made to Maggie because she was insistent that her identity remained anonymous. That Kate said, well, we could ring these people and find out which one. It's obviously one of a few people up in Sydney, all from the same family, or you could tell us. And she told us. She said that my father is Father Vincent Shiel, a man that we later discovered that she was actually living with when I first made contact with her. And she had lived with for a number of years together, and a man that she'd known for most of her life. And she had lived with him ostensibly as, the housekeeper. But there was some sort of relationship in play, and the secret that she was hiding all of a sudden became reality. My worst fears hadn't been realised. He was just an old priest. And, it was incredibly disappointing to learn that was the explanation. I didn't care that he was a priest. I didn't care that she was a nun. The 30 years, it was exactly 30 years of being run around in circles with lies, led to this dusty old priest that she'd known all her life. And I later discovered that she had a wonderful relationship with him, that, even though there was 30 years difference in age, a lot of paternal family said, yeah, they were great mates. They were always together. They were doing everything together. They'd known each other for decades and decades.
In the Disney version of this, she would have been unburdened of her secret finally and would have poured forth with memories and stories and photos of the two of them together and filled in so many of the blanks of your history and family. But that's not what happened.
No, initially she felt incredibly unburdened and intimated there would be some ongoing communication, but fairly quickly, within days of confirming who he was, she really went back into her shell and shortly after learned that all of his possessions were gone. She did have a photo, which she sent to me, but she had none of his belongings. The apartment she was in, they had lived in for 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years. All of his possessions were gone. And, I think the shame of, or the realisation of all of the untruths that I've been told, and I think what dawned on her, additional to the shame of that, was my friends and family are going to find out, and they don't know, and they're very likely to find out if this becomes public. And she just went underground again, and she felt wonderful, I think, for 5 minutes, and then was just burdened with this enormous shame, and communication ceased again.
She'd been 27 and he was 30 years old. I was 57 when she had you. They'd known each other, as you said, since she was a teenager. He was quite a well-known, well-liked, charismatic, confident man of the cloth. When she was pregnant, she was sort of sent away, so nobody realised that she'd ever had a child, of course. With what you've learned, how do you view their relationship now? As a love story or as something creepy and inappropriate? How do you see it?
Look, it's incredibly complicated. It's certainly those things you said. I'll never know the true nature of their relationship. And, I think even for my mother, the true nature of it was 63 years ago. It's pretty hard to recollect accurately, and particularly if there's so much shame and pain attached to it. I think it's coercive, regardless of how they felt over each other, and without doubt it's spiritually abusive. There's a lot of grey around definitions, but it's a form of sexual abuse. My mother was, for a time, a part of his congregation, a parishioner. She believed the priest was the hands and feet of God on earth. How do you say no to that? And how do you say no to that when the man is 30 years older, he's wealthy, he's educated, he's travelled the world, he'd been a house builder, he owned a few houses, and he was God on earth in the eyes of my much, much younger mother. It's wrong. It's wrong in every conceivable way, regardless of how she felt about it at the time.
You're right that the children of priests are the sleeping giant that the Catholic Church prays will never fully awaken. When you learned that you were the child of a priest, what did you learn about how many more of you are out there?
One of the common experiences is when you learn that, earth-shattering reality is you think, that doesn't happen, I'm the only one. And Dr. Google tells you that there's thousands and thousands of articles of priests having children and nuns having children, and that there was an organisation in Ireland, there were organisations in France and Germany and Ireland. The number one English-speaking organisation was one called Coping International, and it spoke about, or its leader spoke about, a minimum of 10,000 children of priests. And, not too long after I, found this out in 2018 that my father was a priest, pretty quickly went up to 20,000. There's a French newspaper that's now talking about a minimum of 50,000 priest children that have not been educated by their father and not supported by their father. So nobody knows how many there are. The church doesn't know. The church systematically hides the information in as much as each bishop has the ability to resolve issues such as these. There's no siphoning up or collection of data to a central point. So I learned when I first went to the church and said, one of your priests has had a child and it's me. The bishop is God on earth and has the ability to resolve this issue and does not have to report in any way, that there's no policy within the church. In Australia, there's not even a guideline. They say they're working on it. I've actually seen some of the words that they're kicking around, but it's optional. So the priest can do whatever they want to do. And I very quickly learned that there's, in 2014, a United Nations Rights of the Child bunch of recommendations, 80-odd recommendations that were made to the Vatican around issues mainly that resolved with church abuse of minors, but there were 3 or 4 issues specifically dealing with children of priests. And what clicked in my head was that the United Nations very strongly urged the Vatican to stop making the mothers, and in some instances the children, sign NDAs or confidentiality agreements. And all of a sudden it became clear why people weren't talking, because the people that were more inclined to talk had been gagged. And the United Nations had given the Vatican until 2017 to respond to these recommendations, and they didn't. So they gave them another couple of years and they still haven't responded. I was so intrigued as to why there weren't people in the media talking about it. There were a couple of organisations, as I say, the main one in Ireland in the English-speaking world, but why was it people weren't speaking? And it's because they've been gagged.
How do you see yourself? You know, I think what became so clear after you confronted Maggie with the knowledge that you knew who your father was, she really conscripted you into her shame and into her secret keeping, which felt just so cruel.
Controlling, yeah.
And controlling, because what did you owe her? And yet she should have owed you everything. And yet you've been very careful to protect her.
Yeah, look, I was very angry with Maggie for the vast majority of the 30 years that I've known who she was. And I think for good reason, that she really did mess me around.
I was angry with her too, just reading your book.
Yeah, well, look, I really hope that by the end of it you feel sympathy for her, because I do.
Yeah, I did. I came around to the compassion. How did you do that?
Because I spoke to a lot of children and to some of the mothers, and all I see is broken people. It's what she is. And I think she was just operating from a powerless position, as all of these mothers are. And who knows? No one knows how many of them have been gagged through an NDA or some sort of, inferred power by the church. Very often in talking to the mothers, the church would put a roof over their heads and there wouldn't be a contract, but it was all on the agreement that this has to stay secret. And if it's not, you're going to be living on the street. Or the child would end up being educated within the church system. But if anyone ever finds out, you will be on the street and you'll be shamed. And I know many people who have lived with that fear and shame and the misogyny within the Catholic Church. The more I looked under the surface of this thing, the more shocking it became to me and the more angry I became about what I found. And this book wasn't really meant to be a book. I was supposed to take a year off work to research my father and find out who the hell he was. And he'd done some amazing things in his life. I just wanted to research it. I'm a journaler and, I just wanted to kind of record the family history once and for all. And the more I found out about the children of priests and the scandal that I think it is, the more it became obvious that this enormous number of people that are victims of the church and have been gagged by the church and are voiceless. They're either contractually obliged to be silent or many of them, 30, 40, 50 years later are still undergoing, fairly intensive psychological support for the trauma of what they've experienced. And it became obvious to me that this needed to be public, that people need to know about it. And hopefully that there's mothers out there that might get the strength to talk to their kids or kids to forgive their mothers.
Just finally, Brendan, you're right. If there is a villain or a bad guy in this, it's Father Vin Shiel, even though he also was a product of his time and his upbringing and his religion and the teachings and regulations of the church. How did his relationship with Maggie end, and when did it end?
Well, he was a gambler, a punter. He was known all over the northern South Australian desert parish that he operated in as a gambling man.
It's not very godly.
No, it's sort of interesting. It's that thin edge of the wedge, or the slippery slope. Everyone knew he was a gambler. And, if you turn a blind eye to little things, they can become big things. And they believe the propaganda. They think they are Christ on earth and that they can get away with anything. And many of them did, as we've found through the Royal Commission. So he was a mad punter, and he lived through till 90 years of age and went to the races still at 90 years of age 3 times a week. Living with my mother, she drove him 3 times a week in the car. They were coming home from the races and nattering away, having a conversation, and she turned to see why he hadn't replied to the conversation, and he died. She said she'd always said to him, "Now, don't you go dying in the car, I won't know what to do." And he did, and I don't know what she did. But look, he had a really indulged life. He sort of lived with very few restrictions. And my mother had the opposite. She had no opportunities. My father had every opportunity and maximised his potentials at every turn. And the mothers of priest children, by and large, fit the stereotype of Maggie. She's the stereotype, much younger, very little opportunity to earn money. So not educated, not many people in those days were, but she didn't have a qualification. She didn't have strong family support. And everything she was, Vin was the opposite. He had everything. And she said she didn't love him. And she had no choice but to be his housekeeper. And I believe it's abusive. And she's one of, I think many hundreds of women in Australia that have had that sort of relationship. She just had to make the best of it.
What does she think of the book? Have you spoken to her?
I sent the letter today.
What are you expecting? Radio silence?
Well, I'd like to help her, if she wants help. Mm. I've offered to send her the book, but I realise it will cause her pain. Maybe she just needs to read the last couple of chapters. I expect she'll want to put her head in the sand, and I perfectly understand that. She's 90 next year. I just wish her well.
As someone who isn't adopted, I always used to imagine that when people find their biological parents, it's like this magical happy ending to their story. But what I've learned, and what you just heard from Brendan, is that it's really very complicated, even if your parents aren't a nun and a priest. And so I'm always grateful when someone is willing to have a hard conversation out loud. That kind of vulnerability is really generous. And I want to just reiterate that Brendan is still really protective of his mother. He feels enormous sympathy for her now, and he doesn't want to paint her out as a bad guy. You can buy Brendan's book, Tell No One, via the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. And if you want to support the work that we do here at No Filter and at Mamamia and get access to some of the subscriber-only episodes that we make, become a Mamamia subscriber via the link in the show notes. The executive producer of No Filter is Kimberly Bradish, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll be back in your ears next week.